Get ready for the unknown. If you love feeling the chill down your spine and venturing into stories that will take your sleep away, subscribe to our channel now and activate the bell. Don't miss the next horror tales that will take you to the darkest corners of your mind. Are you ready to face your fears? Portal is open. Enter, if you have the courage. Where is Lucas? This question echoed daily in Julia's mind ever since her son mysteriously disappeared 5 years ago. The pain never went away, and every day was a struggle not to succumb to despair. Julia and her husband Marcos tried to move on, but the house was impregnated with Lucas's absent presence. Then one night she saw the shadow of a child running down the corridor, and her heart stopped. The next instant, the emptiness set in again. It must be my mind playing tricks on me, she thought, trying to convince herself. But that same week, Marcos began to notice something strange too. Small footsteps, muffled laughter coming from far away, as if a child was playing in the house. At first he didn't mention anything to Julia, fearing that his mind was projecting the pain of the past. However, the apparitions began to intensify. One night, while they were watching television, Lucas's that image briefly appeared in the reflection of the window, and they both froze. "What's going on here?" Julia whispered, but Marcos had no answers. They had spent years looking for Lucas, following false leads, and facing the agony of not knowing what had really happened to him. Now, the presence of their lost son seemed closer than ever, but in a disturbing way. Julia felt that something was wrong. That figure appearing in the shadows was not the Lucas they knew. Over the next few days, Lucas's figure seemed to materialize in different parts of the house, always in moments of deep silence. But there was something different in his eyes. A deep sadness, an emptiness that had never existed before. Julia felt that her son was trying to communicate something she still couldn't understand. The house, once silent and sad, now pulsed with a dark energy, as if it were trying to reveal a hidden secret. Determined to understand what was going on, Julia began to investigate everything she could about disappearances in the area. It was then that she found an old article hidden away in a local newspaper about a series of child disappearances that had taken place over several decades. All the investigations seemed inconclusive, and the cases were shelved. But there was one connection that the investigators seemed to have overlooked. All the disappearances were linked to an obscure group, a cult that performed macabre rituals with children. Julia felt her stomach turn when she read the details about the cult. They believed that the sacrifice of a child could grant members immortality, and the victims were chosen at random, taken from their families without a trace. The cult disappeared from the headlines years ago, but Julia knew at that moment that Lucas had been taken by them. The shock of the revelation paralyzed her for a moment, but she knew she had to go on. She told Marcos about what she had discovered, and together they began to investigate the past of the house where they lived. The house had belonged to one of the cult's leaders, a man called Gabriel Santiago, who had mysteriously disappeared after the last child abduction. He was believed to have died, but his body was never found. Marcos and Julia realized that they had lived all that time on a ground drenched in horror and blood, without even knowing it. Julia was convinced that Lucas was trying to warn them about what had happened to him, that his spirit was trapped in the house, seeking revenge for what had been done to him. Each night, Lucas's apparitions became more frequent and intense. But there was something darker about the manifestations. Along with the figure of the boy, other shadows began to appear, larger, indistinct figures that seemed to watch from afar. Marcos began to have nightmares about rituals, children screaming and being taken away by hooded figures. The house was alive with memories of the tragedy, and it seemed that the cult still had an influence on the place. Julia knew she was getting closer to the truth, but she couldn't predict what was to come. The next few days were unbearable. Julia and Marcos began to feel that they were no longer alone in the house. The presence that had previously seemed to be that of Lucas now became more threatening. The air was always cold, and there was a constant feeling that something or someone was watching them. Objects in the house began to move on their own, doors slammed in the middle of the night, and on occasions the muffled sound of children crying could be heard coming from the basement. Marcos decided it was time to seek help. He found a local paranormal investigator, Augusto, who accepted the challenge of investigating the house. "Something has happened here," Augusto said as soon as he entered, his face serious. "This energy is ancient and is fueled by pain and sacrifice." By carrying out a series of measurements and rituals, Augusto was able to detect the presence of various entities in the house. The figure of Lucas was the strongest, but there were other shadows that seemed to be attached to the place. During one of the investigation sessions, something frightening happened. One of the basement doors opened by itself, revealing an ancient altar covered in dust and symbols that Augusto identified as part of ancient invocation rituals. "This is the place where they performed the sacrifices," he said with a grave tone. The children's blood still seemed to be soaked into the walls, and Julia felt her heart break as she imagined Lucas in that place. The shadows intensified as the group descended into the basement. Lucas appeared again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, hooded figures moved in the shadows, as if they were always lurking. The investigator realized that Lucas's spirit was trapped, surrounded by those shadowy entities that still exerted control over him. The cult may have physically disappeared, but its members, or at least their souls, still inhabited space. Julia felt the weight of her responsibility. Lucas needed help to escape from that spiritual prison, but freeing him would mean confronting the dark forces that controlled the basement. She didn't know if she would have the strength, but she couldn't abandon her son again. Determined to free Lucas, Julia followed Augusto's advice and began studying spiritual liberation rituals. She knew she was dealing with something much more powerful than just disturbed spirits, but the love for her son drove her on. Every day, the shadows became more aggressive, and the nights were plagued by screams and terrifying visions. Marcos tried to be strong, but the fear of losing Lucas again consumed him. During one of the most intense nights, while they were trying to perform the liberation ritual, the lights in the house began to flicker, and the shadows took on a solid form. Julia clearly saw the hooded figures that belonged to the cult, surrounding Lucas's spirit as if they were preventing his release. "They're not going to let him go," said Augusto, feeling the growing pressure in the room. The final confrontation was about to take place. The entities began to physically press down on Marcos and Julia's bodies, suffocating them with an oppressive presence. With every step they took towards the altar, they felt as if they were being dragged into darkness. Lucas, for his part, reached out to them, as if begging for help, but the cult members held him back, their voices whispering incomprehensible words. Julia knew she had one last chance. Gathering all her strength, she recited the final words of the liberation ritual. The air around her began to break, the shadows retreated momentarily, and Lucas took a step towards her. But before he could reach her, one of the cult members grabbed his hand. An intense light exploded in the basement, and everyone fell to the floor, panting. When Julia opened her eyes, silence reigned. The shadows had disappeared, and so had Lucas. She screamed her son's name, but the investigator explained that Lucas had finally been freed. He was at peace. However, Julia knew that part of herself had also left with him. After the ritual, the house finally returned to silence. The dark energy that surrounded it had disappeared, but Julia and Marcos's pain remained. They knew that by freeing Lucas, they had also accepted the fact that they would never see him again. Anna decided to investigate what was going on. Clara's stories began to disturb the family's tranquility, and the nights became tense. The laughter that used to echo through the house was replaced by whispers and footsteps that Anna heard in her sleep. One night, while Rodrigo was away on a business trip, Anna heard Clara talking to herself in the basement. She went downstairs slowly, feeling the air heavy. When she opened the door, Clara was on her back, sitting on the floor, looking into the darkest corner of the basement. "Lucas says he has to leave, but the others won't let him," said Clara, without turning around. Anna, in a state of shock, ran to her daughter and got her out, but the feeling that something was watching her remained. That house held more secrets than Anna could have imagined. When Rodrigo returned from his trip, she decided to tell him everything, but he remained skeptical, believing that it was just the influence of Clara watching things on television. Meanwhile, Rodrigo began to have recurring nightmares. He dreamt of children crying, locked away in some dark place, their voices drowned out by the screams of adults. In one dream, he saw the figure of a hooded man holding something in the basement, a child whom he immediately recognized as Lucas. When Rodrigo woke up in a cold sweat, he decided it was time to get serious. The house was trying to tell its story, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He and Anna went to the city registry office and searched the records of the house. The names of Yulia and Marcos appeared, but what drew the most attention was the former owner, Gabriel Santiago, the cult leader who had disappeared. Rodrigo began to understand that the house's dark past was not buried. It still permeated the atmosphere, and the spirit of Lucas, whom Clara seemed to have drawn back, was once again trapped. The situation intensified when Clara began to behave more and more strangely. She began to speak as if she were in constant dialogue with Lucas, accurately describing details about the rituals the cult performed. Lucas showed me the place where they did it. He said, "You can't leave until everyone else can too," Clara told her one night. Anna felt terror growing inside her. One weekend, Clara disappeared for a few hours, sending her parents into a panic. They found her in the basement, sitting in the same spot where Anna had found her days before. There were drawings of symbols on the floor, and Clara seemed to be in a trance, as if she were being guided by an invisible force. Anna and Rodrigo realized that they were no longer dealing with a simple ghost of a child. There was something stronger, more ancient, controlling events in the house. Rodrigo decided to contact a paranormal specialist, someone who could help him understand what was going on. When the specialist arrived, he immediately felt the density of the atmosphere. He explained that Lucas's spirit was trapped by darker forces linked to the cult of Gabriel Santiago, and that the spirit of the cult leader still maintained a link with the house. Lucas was just one part of a larger cycle of suffering and pain. The only way to free Lucas and the other souls trapped there would be to directly confront the energies that dominated the place. But this would require a profound emotional and spiritual sacrifice, something that Anna and Rodrigo were not prepared to face. With the experts' help, Anna and Rodrigo began to prepare the liberation ritual. They knew they were dealing with powerful, malevolent forces that would do anything to continue imprisoning Lucas and the other souls. The basement became the epicenter of paranormal activity, and Clara began to speak less and less, her connection with Lucas now stronger than ever. On the night of the ritual, as the specialist recited the ancient words and lit candles around the symbols in the basement, the shadows began to stir. The air became icy, and an overwhelming presence filled the room. The figure of Gabriel Santiago appeared, surrounded by the spirits of the other cult members. Their faces were distorted, trapped between this world and the next, feeding off the fear of everyone there. Clara, who had previously been in a trance, opened her eyes and stared at the figure of Lucas, who was now clearly materializing alongside the dark spirits. "I can't leave until everyone is free," he said in a sad voice, echoing through the basement. The specialist, Anna and Rodrigo, knew that this would be their last chance to free Lucas. They would need to face Gabriel and the other spirits to break the cycle of pain. During the climax of the ritual, an intense light filled the basement, and the figures of Gabriel and the cult members began to scream, writhing. The candles around Lucas went out, and he looked at Clara, who held out her hand to him. The connection between the two was strong, and it was Clara who, with her innocence, managed to free Lucas's spirit. When the ritual finally ended, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The presence of Gabriel Santiago and his cult had been destroyed, and Lucas was finally at peace. Clara, who had been the link between the two worlds, returned to her normal behavior, as if nothing had happened. She smiled at her parents and said, "Lucas said thank you." Rodrigo and Anna knew that the house would never be the same, and decided it was time to leave it behind. The basement was sealed, and the history of the house was buried in the city's old archives. But Anna, looking at the garden for the last time before she left, felt that Lucas, somehow, would always be with them, in peace. The house, now free of the cult's dark influence, looked just like an old building, without the traces of terror it once bore. But those who passed by at night could still feel a faint whisper in the wind. as if the memories of lost souls still inhabited the walls, even if they were freed. Anna, with a relieved heart, knew that, despite everything, the cycle was finally over. Or so she hoped.